Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Minds on Guard, where we're discussing the concept of media and all of the ways that we interact with it, that it interacts with us, the ways that our behavior is shaped and controlled by it, the ways in which it's used by programmers and people who create it in order to direct our behavior and use it to their ends. We've covered a lot of ground, looking at some articles, taking a little bit of dive into some history, into some psychology, and a little bit of personal material. In the last video, we were in some content discussing a few characters from the 1800s and the early 1900s, specifically a professor named Wilhelm Wundt from Leipzig, Germany, and a protege of his, an American protege of his, named G. Stanley Hall. Wilhelm Wundt was the father of modern psychology and really experimental psychology, dealing with the directed control of behaviors, and his whole work on the idea of consciousness and the human soul was sort of what we dove into, which fed into a discussion regarding the evolution of a modern education system that was adopted by American thinkers and brought over from Germany and installed in our country, and it has influenced us right up until this day. As I said, the last person we discussed was G. Stanley Hall, who brought the psychological experimentation from the Leipzig laboratory over to Johns Hopkins University and established the American Psychological Association and a lot of the journals and expert literature that is used right up to today. So we're going to dive back into a little bit more of that, similar content this time. The next person that we need to take note of in the progression of the deconstruction of the American education system was a student of G. Stanley Hall's, a man named John Dewey. Let's check some of his work out. So John Dewey was dubbed the father of the American education. Dewey was the man who truly married the ideas of Wundt's thesis regarding experimental education into the classrooms all across America. After studying briefly under G. Stanley Hall at Johns Hopkins University, Dewey would publish the book Psychology, which was the first textbook that included the revisions to the subject that had been developed in Leipzig. In 1895, he was invited to join the faculty at the University of Chicago, where he was allowed to establish his own education laboratory, much like the one that was established in Leipzig. Here, he would apply his understanding of the experimental psychology rooted in the Leipzig lab to the study of education, early childhood education, and early childhood learning. Dewey would put his theories into practice at the Rockefeller Endowed University, and it would be important to understand that connection later, and it would really be wise to become familiar with that name, the Rockefellers. Dewey's experiments and methods were in very stark contrast to the traditional forms of education that had been established in America. In his own words, quote, "Education consists either in the ability to use one's powers in a social direction or else in ability to share in the experiences of others and thus widen the individual consciousness to that of the race. The ultimate problem of all education is to coordinate the psychological and social factors. The coordination demands that the child be capable of expressing himself, but in such a way as to realize social ends." Unquote. Remember, we talked about the idea of socialization and how a man's consciousness and a man's choices are not predicated on his individual determinism or determination of his own will, that it's all just a collection of experiences that can be directed and guided to achieve certain outcomes that any designer of a system would prefer something to end up being. So Dewey really embraced this and brought it into his ideas that founded the modern education system of the United States. It must be understood that while these ideas do seem normal in today's time, at the time of their inception into the American school system, they were seen as quite revolutionary and radical. Returning to Paolo Leone's book, The Leipzig Connection, he writes, "The Wundtian redefinition of education to mean feeding experiential data to a young brain and nervous system rather than the teaching of mental skills led to the abdication of the traditional role of the teacher as educator. Its place was taken by the concept of the teacher as a guide in the socialization of the child, leading each youngster to adapt to specific behavior required of him in order for him to get along in his group." The emphasis is the author's. This shift in the way we teach our children would be a major turning point in American culture that has led us down some rather dark and dangerous paths over the decades, and has put the founding ideals that were set down at the beginning of this country in order to safeguard the freedom and liberty of all American people in what I consider to be the greatest jeopardy that we've faced as a nation. In 1898, John Dewey published an essay titled "The Primary Education Fetish." Now, Dewey held to a socialist ideology. That was his worldview, it was his political leaning. And this essay was meant to lay out his ideas for establishing what he and other progressive ideologues of the time viewed as a collectivist utopia. Dewey was a staunch humanist, and he shed his Christian upbringing in favor of a worldview that rejected the teachings of sacred scripture. Instead, Dewey and his colleagues from the Leipzig lab placed their faith in science, psychology, and evolution. He understood that the American way of life, rooted in the spiritual and philosophical underpinnings of the Judeo-Christian values of individualism and personal responsibility, was utterly antithetical to his designs for a transition into a collectivist society. In order to see the change that he wished, Dewey knew that he must undermine the capitalist system that allowed for the freedoms of American culture, undergirded by our Constitution and its protection of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This would have to be toppled and replaced by a socialist system, which he saw to be a morally superior way of life. In order to carry out this undermining of the American way of life and our individualism, Dewey reasoned that the most effective route would be to slowly and methodically change the minds of the people of this nation from that of the free-thinking individuals into fully socialized collectivists, so that they would come to accept and even welcome a type of communist revolution in America. While Dewey had his ideas well before the violent takeovers of Lenin, Castro, and Mao, he knew that socialism would never, ever be accepted in America through brute force. He knew that the, quote, change must come gradually. To do this, the progressives would infiltrate the public school system and change the way that children learn to think by changing the way they learned to read. The aim would be to lower the nation's literacy rate over the coming generations, thus making the children of America more amenable to collectivist values. If you take away a child's ability to read and deal with the written word and the media that is used, information communicated through those words, and their ability to learn and think for themselves is dramatically diminished. By doing this within the public school system, the parents of all the children within that system would be none the wiser regarding what was happening to their kids. Much of this plan is detailed in another book that I highly recommend, entitled The Crimes of the Educators by Samuel Blumenfeld and Alex Newman. In this book, the authors describe a coordinated conspiracy aimed at destroying our constitutional republic. It's rooted in the Wundtian experimental psychological theories of behavior modification, Dewey socialist ideals, and a bankroll of philanthropic organizations. Recall the Rockefeller name that I mentioned earlier. Along with the deliberate dumbing down of America and the Leipzig connection, these books paint a picture of an extremely hostile takeover of the minds of America's youth by large globalist elites who will stop at nothing to centralize their power and control in order to enslave the world to serve their collectivist utopian vision. The very first question I asked back at the start of this series was, how well do you think you are able to understand the world around you? If we dig one layer deeper, we may ask ourselves, how well am I able to read, track context, and form thoughts that connect what I'm reading to what I actually see in reality? The answer to this question must be given in full honesty, truly digging in, looking for bias, as we've talked about before. For in honesty, there is freedom to move forward and to grow from where we currently are positioned. We must also understand that there is a war going on. I've mentioned this before, and I will continue to say it again. Our minds have been under attack for generations. It started early on in our lives. It was implanted into the education system, and we must fight with every ounce of our energy so that we don't have to give up any more ground to those that would seek to control and manipulate us. So, John Dewey, G. Stanley Hall, and Wilhelm Wundt are just three of the characters that I want us to keep in mind when we're thinking and discussing further evolutions in media, because their work in experimental psychology is really crucial to understanding just how it is that we've got to where we are today. A lot of their aims were to deal with behavior modification through outside stimulus. If we think about the media today, social media, news media, we are bombarded with emotional triggers and various types of stimulus that are aimed at controlling and manipulating our thoughts. The reason I want to go into some of the educational material is to get us thinking in historical patterns, to try to spot nexus points and infiltration areas where we can track what was actually being done across time so that we can deal with things as they are today in a more accurate light, more revealing light. I hope this was informative. I know we kind of got into a little bit and then we jumped back out to get a little bit serious, but I think the point in hammering home the idea that we are at war, and the war is for our thoughts, the war is for our minds, which is why I named this channel Minds on Guard. I want us all to be able to deal with the world well, to think well. The programming that was instilled in our lives was damaging. It caused a lot of harm and is continuing to cause harm. The aim of this channel is to help people deal with that and come out of that sleep and that hypnosis that was, enacted upon us early in our lives, and it continues to this day. My heart in making this content is to help and to open people's eyes to try to heal and move past the programming to live more fully realized lives, free from all of these really broad, dark, manipulative forces. I do have a heart for love, I have a heart for healing, and I have a heart for helping. So I hope that this information is informative. I hope it's fun. I hope you're learning something. I hope that everyone watching is continuing to take care of themselves, through these really tumultuous times, and I hope that you all remember to stay diligent and remain vigilant with your minds on guard.